Okay, let's get started. I have no idea what's been happening with participation numbers. It's kind of, I think there are two people switching in from the outside, which is okay-ish, but I feel like the people in the room are getting, I mean not lower, but participation numbers are certainly dropping quite noticeably, which means that good for you. I will cover most of it. We will talk about Austenland very briefly. We kind of sum up what we started off last week already with, is it a heritage film, is it not? That's what we're going to start off with. Then I'm going to kind of finish up the entire question of what does Austenland, and in particular the two Austenlands you had to kind of trace within the scenes, namely the first one that is the very Austen Regency era kind of Austenland, and in the end the Austenland that is much more, I don't want to say even more commodified, but certainly more Americanized in some form. And very much like Disneyland, like a theme park, even though the first one is of course very, very similar to that. Okay, so far so much disclaimer. We will cover also, or we will start at least with the scene analysis of the Kingsman. I have again uploaded two shared Google documents, same thing as usual for you. That's of course, that's something you can do at home. For those of you that are not here or are not kind of tuning in currently, I would also ask you to do that at home. We'll just start off with that. Okay, but now first Austenland. I hope that at least from both scenes I have at least two people, one person here. I think perfect, and I think brilliant. So 4 people, 2 groups, perfect. Let me just very briefly go back to the questions I've posed, and then we can talk about Austenland in a sec. Maybe in general, if you, I mean, I'm not going to go, or we're not going to go too much into the analyses of the scene. I've checked it this morning. That seems to be pretty good already. But what I'm interested in is, of course, your opinion on whether Austenland can be considered a heritage film or not. And of course, the all-pervasive question that has plagued us this semester is, what is the national identity, or what kind of national identity is being shown on screen, and which one is transported by the movie? And that, of course, means that the 4 of you in the room have to talk a lot more than you would usually have to. So, who wants to go first? I don't know your names, but now I have a very easy way of picking out my first victim if I want to. Maybe start with the scene from the beginning. That's your scene. Okay, then.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So I wouldn't really classify it as a heritage film. I don't know. It uses imagery from heritage film, definitely. In the way when we analyzed the scene, it was pretty clear. We talked about the setup, the house, this typical rural, gentry setting of Jane Austen, which is evoked, but it's interesting because the two protagonists, Miss Ernstwhile or Jane, and Jennifer Coolidge's character, I don't know her name right now.
Miss Charming.
Miss Charming, yes. Yep. They are obviously American, and it's interesting pitted against each other the national identities of the British and the American people. And I would say if it's pro any national identity, it's more American, especially taking into account the end of the film, that the authenticity can only be brought out by the American characters, and the British characters are always just playing a role if they're not if it's not brought out by the main character who is American. So I don't really see any focus on British national identity, I wouldn't say.
Okay.
Just a performance of it, which is then real.
So concerning national identity, you would argue that this kind of highlights the artificiality of these identities because it's kind of played for an audience, a very particular audience. Okay, yeah? What about the other person of that group?
Well, I think I have a pro for a heritage film because I think the setting is as important as the character. But I have to say that I think the setting is really cliched and over-emphasized, maybe, or artificial. So that could be seen as a point against it too.
Mm-hmm.
They are very bright colors and it seems not that authentic.
Okay.
Yeah, more like a parody.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Interesting with the colors. I think we have a very particular image of Jane Austen's England in mind that isn't as bright and as colorful as you know, Austenland portrays it to be. If you think back to Emma, that was also very colorful, very, I mean, more in a pastel kind of, I don't want to call it diluted, but a certainly desaturated kind of way, but it was still very colorful. Would your points, I would agree to that, especially the artificial setting. It is kind of highlighted that it is artificial, you know, with the fake birds and someone kind of throwing stuff that you can shoot and all of these things. But would it have been different if you hadn't had the prologue where Jane kind of comes to Austenland, but if we had started right bang in the middle of the film with no sort of American person going to Austenland, to England? Would that have changed?
I answer this question because I've only seen the beginning.
Okay.
And but from that point of view, it seems really artificial. And
Okay.
yeah, but I don't know if this changes until later on.
Not much. No, it's constantly highlighted that this is a performance. You also have a very strange kind of Sense and Sensibility thing going on with the play within the play. So there's that. No, it's not Sense and Sensibility. It's actually, I think, Mansfield Park. One of the two has this play within the play. So there is always the highlight that this is a performance and this is being performed for these three people that have sort of booked these packages in the beginning from Mrs. Wattlesbrook. What about the other group? What is your take on heritage film, yes or no? Maybe both in general, but also with regard to your scene. Yes.
I would say maybe in general it has some points of a heritage film because it is like this Jane Austen heritage thing with the beautiful New England landscape and the people in these Regency like dresses and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But like particularly our scene has not the tiniest bit of British feel to it, I thought.
Mm-hmm.
Like this woman whose name I don't remember anymore.
Miss Charming.
Thank you. She
You're welcome.
bought this whole Austenland thing and made a real theme park out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like really pink, plastic, American style. So it doesn't actually feel British anymore. It's rather this, well, romantic cliche thing that is like put onto Jane Austen. But actually, if you go deeper into the text, it's like a little bit more controversial. But yeah.
Well, you've never been to Dickens World. There's, I think, in Kent, there's a small theme park about Charles Dickens where actors in costumes kind of lead you around and explain things to you. So there's also that. Yeah, exactly. Anyways, but Jane Austen is certainly not as theme park-like in England as you know, Jane Austen, or as Austenland portrays in the end. Maybe looking at film technical aspects, what could kind of go into the direction of pro-heritage film, what could go into the direction of not being one? Because, I mean, Hickson talks a lot about the aesthetics of the heritage film. Yes?
Well, we had in the beginning of our scene close-up moving out into a long shot, where you can first see the persons and then you go out and see the mansion and the park, but you see also the mansion is full capacity. So that, I think, is a factor in heritage films, that you see the mansion.
Okay.
So I would take that in, and I'm not really sure what else can be put into that category.
Yeah.
Also because you mentioned that this guy, I don't know if it's a man or a woman, but talks a lot about this aesthetic thing. I think that really doesn't give off. I mean, you have this feel of the Jane Austen movie just because of the way the whole setting looks, I would say. So it does give off of that vibe, you know, of, for example, if you watch Emma.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say rather Emma than Pride and Prejudice, because Pride and Prejudice is quite earthy toned. And yeah, like you said, Emma's more colorful. But I also heard that the Emma costumes are more historically accurate than the Pride and Prejudice ones, so I would rather focus on that. So yeah, but it does give you that feeling of, yeah, they are all in this kind of mansion, maybe, I don't know how to explain it in English, but typical verarmter englischer Landadel kind of vibe. And also like this, like the people with the platinum package, I thought, were like this high society dressing, and then she has like the basic. The basic copper package, yes. Yeah, like that, and she has like these Elizabeth Bennet dresses, I would say. Like she has these simple made gowns with the earthy tones. And yeah, it just overall gives you that feeling of being in a Jane Austen movie. Even if you know it's staged and really, really artificial, but it does give off that feeling, I would say. Okay. What about the others?
Another point against it being a heritage film is that you have to focus on just one character. I don't know her name, but
Jane Erstwhile.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
But yeah, you don't have as many characters that are equally important, I think. Because, or just in my scene, it looked like it was really focused on her. And maybe we have the antagonist, this woman in blonde with a pink dress.
No, she's not the antagonist. She's actually a very good friend of Jane. So she's kind of a side character, but she, because we're talking about the artificial setting, she always highlights this sort of how we also sometimes perceive Austen, where you have to say certain things. So there's one scene where she goes, "Tally-ho, the British are coming," in this very fake British accent. So she's kind of the comic relief, but she's also an important side character to some degree. The antagonist comes pretty late and is very interesting, but there is generally not such one of these antagonists where you have one, you know, throughout the entire movie in this case.
I would also say that, like, I think it's actually like in a Jane Austen movie where you have like this sort of community of characters that just keep being there the whole time, I would say. But then you have like people who are like higher in focus, I would say.
More in focus.
Like you have this whole group of the people in Austenland, and then like Jane is a little bit the higher focus, and then this
her love interest?
Miss Charming, sort of. Yeah, more like her love interest was Henry
Noble.
Right? He's a little bit more on focus because he's like, yeah, I think in the construction of this whole thing, he's like the Mr. Darcy character.
He is.
And then you also have this other guy, Martin, I think, the Stallbursche, whatever it is in English, who's like this person standing between them, and so it's like this like the main big focus is on this love triangle thing, I would say. But then you have this rest of the group who are, I always have problems differentiating if they are minor characters or if they are just, they just feel all like major characters, but major characters not so much in the focus. So.
It's that would be one of the points for a heritage film. It's more of an ensemble cast. It's not just one character, although Jane is certainly in focus. That goes into the Pride and Prejudice kind of direction, where of course Elizabeth Bennet is the main focus, but the other characters are just as important as she is because they are in relation to her, and those relations are important in order to establish her character. Yeah.
Wanted to say what I find really interesting in the vein of cast is that they chose J.J. Field as the love interest because he has a history of being in Austen adaptations. He was Henry Tilney, I think, in Northanger Abbey in the 2007 film. And also, I just googled that because I was sure that Georgia King, the Amelia Hartwright character, she also was, I think, in BBC productions. She had Little Dorrit, she played in Charles Dickens adaptation, and also in a Jane Eyre adaptation, she had a role. So they do choose some of the actors that are famous for being in this kind of BBC heritage or literary. Yeah,
I'm still listening.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's just I'm having trouble with the whiteboard, but that's a regular trouble. Yes, absolutely. So that's again referring back to Andrew Hickson, who sort of frames the genre of heritage films, and he says that heritage films tend to choose certain actors that are often known for being in such productions. We have Kenneth Branagh, we have Helena Bonham Carter, we have Anthony Hopkins. There is a wealth of British actors that have been used and reused for these heritage films, which makes these heritage films kind of instantly recognizable as such because they use these kinds of actors. And this is what Austenland to a certain degree also does. Of course, Jane and Miss Charming are the outsiders. They are American. They come in from the outside. But the choice of characters, the British actors in this case, they are, as you so rightfully said, very much recognizable from BBC productions. It's the same thing with the Colonel. I think he's also been known for Bridget Jones, but also other sort of historic productions. And yes?
I just had a question about an actor, because like the owner of this Austenland thing at the beginning is like, I don't know her name, but she's played by Jane Seymour.
Yeah.
Does she also have like a heritage connection? Because I only know her as Dr. Quinn.
Dr. Quinn, what is it?
Actually, that's a very good question. Just her husband plays Mr. Hurst in the Pride and Prejudice series of the 1990s. I recognized him immediately, but I'm not quite sure about Jane Seymour. Actually, it's a very good question. Let me Google that for us, because it's also the second.
Oh, she was in the Scarlet Pimpernel adaptation in the 80s.
Oh my God. Okay.
Some
At least some heritage, yeah. Jack the Ripper, meh. The Nanny, interesting. Okay. In this case, probably Jane Seymour isn't exactly known for heritage films, but certainly the rest of the cast. I still think she should have been known for it, because she fits in perfectly well, but not Jane Seymour in this case. But some of the rest of the cast, at least, are known for being part of heritage cinema in this case. Going back to heritage film, yes or no? Do we have any other comments?
The camera movement seems to be quite slow, and it goes in the kind of direction of deep staging, so that would be another point for it being a heritage film.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least in my team, there were no fast cuts, and it was really, fluid.
Mm-hmm. So the editing, the staging, and the camera work would also go into the direction of being pro-heritage film. Okay, any other comments so far? What does that leave us with? Is it a heritage film or isn't it? If we had to decide which, well...
Well, we have more points on the yes side, but I still want to lead on the other side. Because, well, the last scene is just like, just too pink and too bright and too,
yeah.
You know, cliche maybe as well, and also just the whole food thing which is going on, and then the carousel, and it doesn't really, except for the mansion and maybe the few characters which are being shown for like 20 seconds or something. It doesn't really have much to do with Austen, the original Austen.
Okay.
So, well, that's why I see that there are more points on the yes side, but I still don't want to say yes 100%.
Okay.
To be honest, for me it doesn't actually feel like British heritage, but rather like a more, I would say, a Jane Austen heritage.
Okay.
But not to this extent that it feels really British, but rather that it feels like what happens if we have like this fan culture on some topics, and how can it evolve, and what can happen if people go too crazy with something. That's also like what for me fits with this theme park at the end, that you first have this, like, I think this whole thing is like a live action role play.
Yes.
Just, yeah, you pay for it and people play like big role play thing.
The first theme park is certainly live action role play. You pay money to dress in a Regency dress, and then you play a certain pre-scripted story. Yeah. The end is certainly more of a Disneyland kind of character, so it's really a theme park that makes no pretense that the only thing it wants to do is to sell you a certain version of Austen. It also looks like Jane Austen and Legally Blonde have crossed in a very uncomfortable manner, really. Yeah, all right. You had raised your hand, I believe.
No, actually not.
Okay, good. Sorry, then I was just from the corner of my eye, I kept glancing that direction. Okay, you've seen that I've written down two kind of quotes which I found very good that you've given me to work with, namely a real theme park and the original Austen. This is kind of what we're going to cover, because I would absolutely agree with you to say that although it kind of makes the pretense of being a heritage film, you know, it ticks all the boxes. It has the camera work, the editing, the setting is very important. You have those grand heritage sites within the manor, for instance. You have the landscape and the ensemble cast. You have the choice of actors. On a theoretical and very superficial level, it ticks most of the boxes of heritage films. It even gives us a certain kind of England, namely an England that is very much upper class, that is very much focused on the countryside. We have all those beats that it always kind of repeats itself in these heritage films. But I would also argue that it isn't really a heritage film simply because of two things in some form. Namely, one, the framing. We start off in America. We have a very clear sort of a very clear explanation why we are seeing this part of England and this kind of England, namely someone has paid for it to see it. And on the other hand, so you have the commodification character that is being sort of driven or cranked up to 11 at the end with the theme park of Austenland that sort of an American woman has bought and then turned into this kind of theme park. That's the one thing, the framing as well as the commodification. And on the other hand, it's the self-referential nature of this film. Namely that it always tells you implicitly and explicitly that this is fake, this is artificial, this is not real, this is just basically play pretend, or as you've noted, a kind of LARP kind of character, a live action role play. What I, however, find quite interesting that you have both noted that it is not the original Austen, so there's always the question of authenticity, usually something that goes into potentially all of the discussions on Austen films in general. So we've touched upon that Emma, for instance, is historically very accurate, and we always kind of harp on of very accurate, historically accurate, the costumes are historically accurate. This is far more what Jane Austen would have liked to see, what Jane Austen would have been, which we never know because we haven't lived during Austen's times. We can't really say. So what is the original Austen? Is the original Austen something that is like Emma? Is the original Austen something that is Persuasion or Pride and Prejudice, or a comment from the audience?
I did not want to interrupt. I just wanted to add, it's really interesting because the aspect of Austen, like also her biography, was very much influenced by her, I think, great nephew writing her first biography, which sanitized her whole personality, even sanitized the only picture that is existent of her by her sister Cassandra, and just streamlined it into a kind of Victorian idealistic view of her as a character. So like when the years go on and more people like look at her personal correspondence and things like that, it comes out that she was actually not herself fitting into this picture of a clean heritage film. So I always find it very interesting talking about original Austen, and especially I find it also interesting that in 2016 they put the picture, the new picture, so actually the sanitized picture on the £5 note also. So it's really it's like an open secret that it's, but we still all believe in it, kind of, that we know what Austen would have thought when she's herself very elusive.
Absolutely. That is a very good point, namely the idea that we have of Austen is, as you just said, very much sanitized, which makes it very hard to pinpoint what the real Austen is like. And I think, especially if you look at Austen films and the reception of Austen novels, they have been very much in the it's a romance novel, right? It's nothing more. But what Austen actually wrote is very ironic social critique of the times that she was living in. You know, everything from Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet, which has been turned into this great romance, is actually social critique. Persuasion goes into the same direction. It's a social critique of both the Navy as well as these kind of family politics. Austen is known actually for viciously making fun of her characters, of all of her characters. No one's safe from Austen. But this is kind of a personal anecdote, because for the longest time I tried to circumvent Austen as hard as I could, because I had heard of Austen, it was romance novel, it was crap, I didn't want to read it. For the longest time, I think 2019 potentially, every time someone taught a course on Austen, I was like, nope, not going to read that, not going to do that. The only film I had ever watched was Sense and Sensibility, and I only watched it because of Alan Rickman. Let's be fair. No one watched that because of anyone else. Maybe Emma Thompson, no one else. Generally, that was why I knew Austen, and that was what I knew of Austen. And I thought, yeah, the movie is okay. It has Alan Rickman in it, makes it so much better. But after that, nothing more. So I kind of also went into the direction of, it's just romance novel stuff. And then a friend recommended that, and it's actually about the Navy. And I was like, interesting. And then I started to read all of the novels, and I noticed that we have a very, very problematic and very wrong picture, or I at least had a very wrong picture of Jane Austen. So again, we have a strange, very narrow conception of Jane Austen's novels. So talking about the original Austen is very difficult. And then there's the question of the real theme park. What's an unreal theme park? Because that was kind of the comment. It is like a real theme park, but what isn't?
Well, I think she meant it in the way of a real theme park in the sense of the American kind of theme park, where you buy anything, there are huge portions of food, and there's lots of food and different foods, and you know, normally you mentioned something about Dickens before. I would I would think when you have like a historical kind of theme park that you can really learn something about that person and how they live or something. But this is more like, I don't know how to explain it, but Disneyland kind of comes in handy at that point as an argument. Because really, like I said, also legally blonde, everything is pink and
Everything's very pretty.
yeah, and when you go to the perceived Jane Austen kind of picture, this is kind of the exact opposite.
Okay.
The
So-
theme park that is shown.
Okay, so you would argue that something like Disneyland is actually a real theme park because it tells you, I'm a theme park, there is no kind of educational content you will see here. It's mostly, you know, something to sell, something you can buy, an experience you can buy, and an experience we sell, right?
Yeah, but the theme park is mostly about really a theme.
Okay.
Which is maybe now pink or something as the theme, I don't know. But also when we talk about heritage and British heritage, it's more like an American thing, the theme park.
Okay.
Right now, and has not really, in my opinion, not really many British or English connotations.
Okay.
Yeah, I would also say that like our perception of a theme park is like rather like Disneyland, I would say, with like a lot of rides, a lot of food, even though it's strange that you have a lot of food and a lot of roller coasters because yeah, that doesn't work together. But yeah.
Oh, well, you know, Roman emperors also ate a lot and then, anyways, yes, go on.
Yeah, but you waste a lot of money that way. But okay, that's not
It's
what I want.
Disneyland, yeah, it's exactly what I want.
So, yeah, so basically we just have this perception of what's a theme park. I would say, because like if you make it more like educational, it rather becomes like,
Yes.
I don't have an English word for it, but I don't know if there are like Freilichtmuseums in
Aha.
the English content. Like
Yeah.
when you like sometimes there are these things like you have wie so ein Bauernhof oder so Bauernhäuser, and then you can go through and look here they have like old furniture and you can look how old like houses and rooms looked at that time, and
It's really important.
yeah.
I think there's also like a Viking village where you can do just that, where you have people dressed in costumes as Vikings and then you have their
Yeah.
original kinds of tools and furniture and pelts and all of these things.
But that's rather a way of like bringing history to life, I would say. And like a theme park is rather this artificial created thing. I would try to distinguish it that way.
Okay. I'm just listening so far. You had raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think it's really interesting how we talk about the ending, because I do feel it's more honest than, because the whole setting is like an uncanny valley of heritage, and at least in the end, this uncanniness of it wants to look like something that is clearly not, is just lifted, and yeah, we embrace the commodification, I would say.
Okay.
So I actually was very amused by the ending, and I really liked it because I think it's more honest.
Yes, absolutely. I really like the way they kind of also shoot it like an advertisement kind of film. Like, what, you are going to have such a good experience, and someone is undressing and dancing on a stage, and everyone's screaming, and you have tea and crumpets and all of these things. I also find it interesting how we talk about theme parks, because generally in our, you have noted, you've talked about Disneyland, and I would agree, this is a theme park. And the theme is, I'm selling you a particular experience, and that experience can range from, you can pretend to be a fairy, you can finally, for a second I want to say you can finally touch Mickey Mouse, but that sounds a bit weird. But you can finally see your childhood favorites. You can experience the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. There's always experiences that are being sold. Of course, it's not just an experience, because Disneyland wants to sell a lot more than just an experience. It wants to sell food, commodities, merchandise, whatsoever. And then you've said, you know, we have the educational aspect. I don't think that theme park and education necessarily don't go together. You can do both, because I would argue, and you said, you know, it's more artificial, like Disneyland is more artificial. But what is the difference between one of these Viking villages that has been set up in a certain place where a Viking village might have been or might not have been, where actors dress as Vikings, have sort of mock fights, sell you some kind of honey wine, and then kind of pretend to live the life of a Viking? What is the difference between that and someone dressing as Mickey Mouse and running through Disneyland just to shake hands with people? There's... Hi. Okay, yes.
I would also say with theme parks that they are most often based on something that wasn't historically or real at all. Also. Like,
Okay.
I would okay, Disneyland is it's like this big world of stories who are maybe connected, maybe they aren't, and they put a theme park on it. I would also say that Legoland would be a theme park because it's also created in a way. Yeah, okay.
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter things. There's also a theme park, but it's also like something that someone has created, and then there came a fan base, and then they made a theme park. It's not like there is. I think for me a theme park is nothing that has like a historical bounding, but it's rather based on something. I don't want to say pop cultural, but something that was like written, created by someone before, story-wise.
Yeah, all right. Let me play devil's advocate. Pirates of the Caribbean is based on a historical period. It's based on the 17th and 18th century piracy in the Caribbean, at times even pretty accurately.
Yeah, but I would say the Pirates of the Caribbean things are also just in Disneyland because Disney's here bought it.
Okay. But they're still based on a historical kind of basis, some form.
Yeah, but
they use the costumes, they use the ships. Just.
In my opinion, a theme park is more to focus on fun and making money, whereas such kind of museums are more. Yes, they are artificial too, but they are go more in the educational direction, I think.
Okay.
I don't know, in the museum it's not the focus that you want to make huge.
So museums aren't fun, they're not entertaining.
Maybe that's the wrong interpretation, but
I know, I'm just...
Yeah, what I wanted to say. Yeah, of course you have with the Pirates of the Caribbean, you have the ships, and you know, but you don't have this educational thing. You don't learn anything more than it's already shown in the films about the time and how they lived and so on. But you can go on a ride,
on a fun
roller coaster ride or something. I don't know. I wasn't there. In the theme park, but I don't expect that there's anything educational.
Okay.
Maybe how many times can I go on the roller coaster before I cannot go anymore?
That's part of education.
But most people take that as one factor for going to a theme park to kind of maybe just have fun and just a nice vacation or something, maybe just
Oh, oops. So we have the education entertainment kind of discrepancy here.
But we also have not many theme parks in Germany in that way. We don't have a Disneyland or something. We have a Legoland, I think.
Yeah, I think we do.
But we also have the film park Babelsberg.
We do.
Which would also maybe count in that category. But we mostly have such museum types where you can really go to and be educated on
Even Babelsberg does that.
certain parts of history or Germany or something like that.
Yeah.
What I wanted to add to the historic background of Pirates of the Caribbean.
Okay.
I didn't know that it had that background, but I think it possibly it could be that it has like ties to some pirate discrepancies. I don't know, but for the most people, it's just another pirate story. So most people don't perceive it as being like there was that fight between that pirate crew and that pirate crew in 1885 or something like that. But most people just see it as, okay, they are pirates, they're dressed like that, they always dress like that, and they rob some people, okay. It's like they also portray that image that people have of pirate movies, and they just do it. So for most people, I don't think they see the historic background that it maybe has, but it's rather just another pirate story for most of the people.
I would agree with that. What is still interesting is that we make a very clear distinction of what a theme park can and can't do. It can't educate, so everything that has to do with education is more of a museum for us. What I would argue is, and especially if we go back to Austenland, the two Austenlands aren't too different actually. The first one kind of does something similar. It tries to educate you kind of on the Regency era. And we would probably, taking the real theme park into account, we would say that the later one, the second Austenland in a way, that's a real theme park. It doesn't make any pretense of being something that sells stuff. There is no educational background. The only thing you do there is to have fun, be entertained, and that's about it. The first one kind of verges right in between. It is kind of something you do, so you learn something about dress, about I think there's one scene where they kind of do stitching or something, and they go like, so this was what women did, and no one kind of does that with the gloves, and the gloves are completely tied in, and everyone's kind of like, what did they do? So there is kind of the learning aspect, but it's more of I experience it myself. It's a lived experience that I can recreate and reenact. What unites both is that they are hyper-real places. And here I'm going to, and I think I'm not quite sure if I mentioned it in the beginning, but here I'm going to refer to Umberto Eco and his idea of hyper-realism. And it's good that you've already mentioned Disneyland, because this is what Umberto Eco also does. So in 1970s, I think he wrote his travels in hyper-reality in 1975, or at least he published it then. He tours through America, and what he does is he observes America, and what he notes is that America is all about artificiality. Everything that is historic in the States is turned into some kind of theme park, whether it's a wax museum or whether it's these theme towns that he calls toy towns, doesn't matter, but America tries to market itself, to try and market his own history in some form, and this is what he calls hyper-realism. But his main example is not just these little theme parks or these towns where people in costumes lead you around and tell you everything about the Wild Wild West, but his main contention, or his main point of contention, is of course Disneyland, which he has a couple of gripes with, to be fair. So it's not just that. And I do have another quote by William Combe first, which I'm not going to show you too much. But Umberto Eco is very much interested in Disneyland because he notes that this is and I think he calls that the absolute fake. There is no pretense of authenticity any longer in Disneyland. It is all fake. However, in order to be such an absolute fake, these imitations need to not only pretend to be real in some form, and we'll get to that in a moment, but they also need to improve reality. So Disneyland is, for instance, Gothic or Neo-Gothic, but it makes Neo-Gothic architecture, for instance, even better. So if you think of the Disney logo and the castle, that is, at least it pretends to be kind of Gothic, kind of a mix of certain architectural styles, but it improves on it, both through coloring, through adding more terraces, to adding more windows to make it larger, bigger, better, more entertaining, more pretty, more bright. And he notes that in this sense Disneyland is more hyper-realistic than the Wax Museum. So he tours the Wax Museum beforehand and really rants about the way those wax figures are changed. So I think they have added arms to certain statues. I'm not quite sure whether it's the Venus statue, but I think it's the Venus statue, which is usually portrayed without arms, and the Wax Museum adds arms, and Umberto Eco is completely sort of disgusted by it. He doesn't really like it. He is, he's
Italian.
Yeah, he's Italian. He probably feels offended on so many levels, and he writes about that very extensively. And when he comes to Disneyland, he sort of notes that this is just another step in this kind of hyper-realistic way of portraying both history and of portraying other things. So in this sense, Disneyland is more hyper-realistic than the Wax Museum, precisely because the latter still tries to make us believe that what we are seeing reproduces reality absolutely. So if you think of wax figures, they look like uncanny valley things. They are kind of weird, but they pretend to kind of represent reality. Whereas Disneyland makes it clear that within its magic enclosure, it is fantasy that is absolutely reproduced and that is over and over reproduced. So Disneyland does provide us with an absolute fake, unlike, for instance, the Wax Museum, the Toy Towns, or Las Vegas. And everything is... Yes?
Sorry, I always don't want to...
No, that's fine.
I just wanted to say what's really funny, I just looked it up again because I had some memory of that actually the Disney Corporation bought and created a town near the resort where they really do the Celebration Florida, where they want to depict this perfect, 15 white picket fence American life, and
the perfect suburban
it's famous
life.
for having a few murders also, because the Todd family murders, that's why I remember it. It's a big true crime aspect, and a few others of the serial murder also was caught there and things like that. So it's always right now in critique of being just very fake.
Not only very fake, but probably also very expensive, so only available for certain kinds of people, of course. I would argue, just as Disneyland is not exactly available for everybody, because not everyone can sort of go to either Paris Disneyland or to, where is it? Also in Florida, I think.
Yeah. Right here,
My brain said it's in Orlando, but I'm not quite sure what. Oh, it is! Oh, okay.
Orlando, Florida, yeah.
Aha. So my brain was right, it just couldn't geographically locate where Orlando was. So again, this is not exactly available to certain people because prices within Disneyland are very high. Getting there is very difficult, you have to fly, etc. It's very, very expensive in this case, so it's only available for potentially middle class and upper middle class and above, but working class might have a hard time getting there, even though there are probably reduced prices to some extent.
Yeah, but many families, as far as I know, are really saving up just to make their vacation just a week or something in a theme park, which is for me crazy, because when I imagine theme parks, it's just like, okay, you go there and after 5 hours maximum you're through. And then you imagine a week being at a theme park and doing I don't know what, because a week is just such a long time, and just be at the theme park. And it's really, really expensive, but families are really saving up for the family trip.
I have to admit, it wouldn't be something for me. That wouldn't exactly be a vacation spot that I would want to go to. But I think Disneyland has become so large that you can absolutely spend more than a week within it and not have seen everything. So from the rides to the shops to all of these places, I think they have so many rides at this point in time that it is, first of all, very sprawling. Usually you have a hotel located next to it or within it. So you're always kind of in this bubble of, oh God, I sound like someone who wants to sell Disneyland, but this, you know, this magic bubble of Disneyland. So I think you're not stuck in it, but you can experience so much every day and even over and over again that you can spend more than 1 week in it and have not seen all of the rides, all of the points that you have to or can discover. I think they have, for basically each franchise, they have like a mini theme park within the theme park. And yeah, that is just a lot. I always imagined Disneyland to be very small, but then my brother was there and he said that it is definitely not. So there's that. Where was I?
Not many families can.
Oh yes, exactly. I didn't want to go there. Actually, I wanted to talk about the artificiality of Disneyland even further, or basically what Echo has to say about Disneyland. Quite a bit, actually. It's quite nicely written. It feels like someone wrote an opinion piece on Disneyland and then he comes with his semiotic theories, kind of, he sneaks them in and you don't even notice that you're learning something. So that's quite nice. He writes very... it's very accessible writing, at least I think it is. Anyway, so what Disneyland also does, and that's something I said already, these absolute fakes, they need to, on the one hand, improve reality, but on the other hand, they need to make the pretense of being real, of having something, some kind of basis, some kind of root within reality. And this is, if you know, going back to Pirates of the Caribbean, we're kind of stuck with this example right now. By using, for instance, and I mean, Jack Sparrow is an amalgamation of different pirates during the 17th and 18th century. It's, I think, Calico Jack and some others that are being merged into one character, which no one really knows because no one really knows anything about pirates during that time, unless you're very interested in these very niche kind of topics. But they also use Blackbeard. They use the imaginary kind of the imagery that we always recognize. So there is some historical basis because we can immediately locate the costumes and the people and the way they dress and the way they behave. We can locate them both as pirates, but we can also locate them in a very particular historic framework. So again, Disneyland, theme parks in general have to make some kind of pretense of being real. And Echo notes on that, and that's a very long quote. Let me just switch off the camera. And he says, but once the total fake is admitted, so Disneyland on the one hand needs to be real, but also makes no pretense of being artificial, is admitted in order to be enjoyed, it must seem totally real. So the Polynesian restaurant will have, in addition to a fairly authentic menu, a Tahitian waitress and costume appropriate vegetation, rock walls with little cascades. And once you're inside, nothing must lead you to suspect that outside there is anything but Polynesia. If between two trees there appears a stretch of river that belongs to another sector, Adventureland, then this section of the stream is so designed that it would not be unrealistic to see in Tahiti. Beyond the garden hedge, a river like this. And if in the wax museum the wax is not flesh, in Disneyland, then the rocks are involved, they are rock, and water is water, and in this case a tree is a tree. When there is a fake hippopotamus or a dinosaur or sea serpent, it is not so much because it wouldn't be possible to have the real equivalent, but because the public is meant to admire the perfection of the fake and its obedience to the program. So I think there's a ride where they have a Jaws ride where, you know, the shark comes up and swims next to you and all of these things where they recreate the film. So you need to admire how realistic it looks, and of course you're within or you're in this experience, so you're kind of experiencing that differently. In this case, Disneyland is not only produces illusion, but in confessing it, it simulates the desire for it. A real crocodile can be found in the zoo, and as a rule it is dozing or hiding, but Disneyland tells us that faked nature corresponds much more to our daydream demands. And then he goes on where he really tries to see a crocodile, but he doesn't see it in its natural habitat, and so on and so forth. But generally, this is what Eco observes about hyperrealism. It is both an artificial imitation of something, and it makes no pretense that it is that, but it also needs to seem, in this very moment, particularly real for us to believe it. But he also is very critical of it, because he notes that, of course, it is not just realism, because the actual point of Disneyland and of these theme parks and of these hyperreal spaces is not so much to create and improve reality, but it is to sell us something. And this is what he notes here. So the houses of Disneyland are full size on the ground floor, and on a 2/3 scale on the floor above. So they give the impression of being inhabitable, and they are, but also of belonging to a fantastic past that we can grasp within our imagination. The main street facades are presented to us as toy houses and invite us to enter them, but their interior is always a disguised supermarket where you can buy obsessively, believing that you're still playing. The Palace of Living Arts presents its Venus de Milo as almost real, whereas Disneyland can permit itself to present its reconstructions as masterpieces of falsification. For what it sells is indeed goods, but genuine merchandise, not reproductions. What is falsified is our will to buy, which we take as real, and in this sense, Disneyland is really the quintessence of consumer ideology. So what these theme parks generally do is they try to sell us something. And I'll get to Austenland in a moment, because there is a problem with the hyperreal, and here I'm going to refer to Jean Baudrillard, who also talks about the hyperreal and the way our societies sort of give us representations that only refer not to the real thing itself, but to even more representations. And we had that with Austenland. I'm just kind of moving on to that. Austenland, and you said basically that you see references to Pride and Prejudice, you see references to Sense and Sensibility and to Mansfield Park and so on and so forth. And the problem with that is that Austenland doesn't refer to the original Austen, or it doesn't refer to an original time period where Austen has lived. On the one hand, Austenland, and I'm talking about the first Austenland, if I just move on, I talk about that Austenland. That Austenland tells us, you know, this is real. This is more or less the Polynesian restaurant. Within this space, this fake is absolutely real, and we perceive it as real. Or at least the people within, you know, Austenland, in this case, perceive it as real. Even though its main focus isn't so much to provide you an experience or to create reality, but it is, of course, to sell you something, namely word of mouth. People will go on and say, you know, I had a great experience, and this is something the film specifically addresses when the film says, you know, many other women have had a great experience within this Austenland. And also in the end, when Mrs. Wattlesbrook basically tells Jane not to talk shit about Austenland in some way, simply to keep Austenland going in some form as a theme park. Just in this case, this theme park pretends not to be one, because you have the lived-in experience, you can inhabit these spaces. What it also does is it improves on reality. So we're talking about a particular time period, but Austenland, this Austenland in particular, improves on it. It makes it brighter, the clothes more colorful, the rooms bigger, the manners more polite. You know, it kind of adds to that. It is artificial, but it kind of pretends to be real. If we go to the other Austenland, that makes no pretense. All pretenses of creating any sort of reality or improving on any sort of historical reality completely falls away, because in this case, Austenland tells you quite plainly, I am a theme park. I want to sell you goods, namely tea and crumpets, Jane Austen's carousel, food, or probably also costumes. You have little stores and little shops. It isn't about experiencing a time period, but it is mostly about buying stuff. And going back to this Austenland, in this case, what it does, it always refers back to other texts that have dealt with Austen. Whether it's the play within the play, whether it's the relationships within it, it always refers back to Austen to some degree, and to some form of Austen to some degree. And this is where Baudrillard basically comes in, because he argues that we live in a society, is always the best way to start these arguments, but we usually, I'm going to use it anyways, we do live in a society that has been growing in the level of abstraction in some form. And what he kind of means by that is that these representations do not refer to something real. Usually, if you look at semiotics, you have camera refers to a real thing. So this webcam refers to a real thing you can see. Representational sign, the word camera refers to this particular real reference within the real world, right? So simple signifying practice process. But what happens with these simulations and these theme parks is a bit more difficult, or what happens in hyperrealism is a bit more difficult, because there is no real referent any longer. So this is not the simple camera means camera. You have both things sort of with it's an artificial connection, but it's still tangible. But there is no tangible referent here. So Austenland doesn't refer to one Austen text or one Austen England, but it refers to a plethora of other signs, of other representations. It refers to Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, to historical periods, to other texts. There is no one source where this kind of always goes, or where that comes together. But in fact, there are multiple threads and multiple references that are being used and repeated by these films, or in this case by Austenland. Just needing to go back to the PowerPoint presentation. So what he contends is basically that today abstraction is no longer that of the map, the double, the mirror, or the concept. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is the generation by models of a real without a origin or a reality, a hyperreal. The territory no longer precedes the map, nor does it survive it. It is nevertheless the map that precedes the territory. So again, these very simple connections between thing and representations are being split up in hyperrealism, because there is not one thing that connects presentation or the sign with the representational system, but there are a number of things that are being connected. And this is what Derrida has, for instance, later called a difference. So if you look up the word building, it will lead you to another reference to the word structure, and structure will lead you to another reference to a completely different word, and that word will lead you to another difference. So there's never one singular meaning that you return to, but there's always multiple meanings that make up this thing. And in this case, going back to Austenland, Austenland is made up of all the Austen texts, of all, or in this case, of a very particular period of time, of other texts that are not Austen. And this is something one of the reviewers has already noted, or has also noted, that it kind of cites and repeats and reiterates a number of Austen texts. And Barrett, in this case, says, the film contains several gauche nods to Austen. We see a character carrying a pug. There is a pug in Mansfield Park. And Jane's friend Lizzie Charming has affinities to Miss Jennings in Sense and Sensibility. And J.J. Field is superb as the dashing Henry Noble too. In fact, this whole film could be said to have an over-the-top Gothic air that is reminiscent of Northanger Abbey, though really it bears no comparison with Austen's art. So again, it is an imitation, but it refers to a plethora of texts that make up, in this case, this Austenland. Do you have, at this point, any questions so far? Okay. Moving on to the other Austenland, again, this strips away any sort of idea of authenticity. This is not the Polynesian restaurant that Echo describes, but this is just Disneyland as a whole, a theme park that can be accessed, that sells you something. However, and this is why I said a real theme park, both of these Austenlands, this one and this one are essentially theme parks. They sell you experiences, they use roughly similar, if not the same structures. However, one kind of doesn't really hide what it is, as the student that has just left kind of said. It strips away all of these historical authenticity questions, or whether this is the real Regency era, or whether we can only experience Austen if we experience it in a live action role play kind of manner. This theme park strips all of that away. It makes no pretense of what it actually is, namely a commodity. And this is, however, also similar to this Austenland, because also that is a commodity that is highlighted plainly within the film. You buy a certain package to experience a certain part of Austenland. Here, you don't buy a certain package, you buy one ticket, but generally it is also made that you can experience a certain part of Austen, a certain part of England. And I would argue, and this is where I go back to sort of the question of artificiality, because Austenland does not make a pretense of being what it actually is, it cannot be considered a heritage film insofar as it always tells us, I'm selling you something. This is exactly what we're doing here. So the artificiality and the self-referentiality of the film kind of can be attributed also to heritage film, because it is aware of the genre lines, it is aware of the camera work and the editing and all of that. It uses that in a very particular manner, but not in order to tell us, you know, I'm a heritage film, although it makes the pretense. It is an imitation. It improves on heritage films to a certain degree, but it also is something that is sold by us, not by us, but by production companies, namely a particular kind of England, a particular kind of Austen that is being sold through the movie and through heritage films in general. Okay, do you have any questions? Okay, have I completely steamrolled you with all of that? Good. Even better. Then I would say we're going to move on to the last of our heritage films that we're going to cover in this semester, and that heritage film is, of course, the Kingsman, The Secret Service. Usually I wanted to also add the newest Kingsman, but you know, we only have one session with, you know, proper content left, so we're going to be focusing on the first of the Kingsman movies, that is Kingsman, The Secret Service, that came out in 2014. I hope you have seen it. If you haven't, I mean, we have like 20 minutes left or so. I would sort of start working on the scene analyses. You know, no matter how far you get, we kind of can form two groups, but I would sort of leave it up to you which scene you take. You can form groups if you've, you know, become used to it already, but generally we are going to go into the scene analysis. We're going to finish that up next week. Next week we're going to talk a bit more in detail about Kingsman, in particular about the questions of class, because class, I've touched upon it, I've mentioned it. We have usually looked at the experiences of aristocrats or of upper class people, so we're going to be talking about class in particular, something that is particularly fruitful when it comes to Kingsman. So, which means group work for you. I can eventually switch off the live stream, but this is what we're going to sort of cover. Go on, talk about Kingsman next week, and start working on the scene analyses this week. Any questions? Brilliant. Then I'd say off you go. I would also leave it open if you want to start here, or if you, I don't know, want to, you know, move to your other classes. So that I'm going to stay here up until 10:50, but I would leave it up to you how you work on it. Simply work on it for next week. Again, 2 scenes, both of them from the beginning, but again with a specific focus on class. All right? Brilliant. Then the stage is yours.